boys and girls, Mrs. Tento here. I wanted to show you that one of the lanterns like Mary and Laura and Ma and Pa would have used when going out to the barn. Remember when Ma and Laura went out to the barn and Laura carried the lantern that was made out of tin that was punched, and it had a little light inside of it that would leave little spots, flickers of light coming out of it. Here is, and now my candle doesn't do it justice, it's just a little candle inside that's a fake candle, but you can see all the little cut places. This is very much an early American kind of a lantern to take outside so the wind wouldn't blow it out. And I noticed that where it's punched, the bit of metal that's been displaced covers over just a little bit, so I could see how the wind would not have an easy time getting in and blowing it out. But I have two of these. They're green, pine green in color, a little dusty, but I haven't used them this last year. So I do have a real candle inside as well. I'll show you the inside because this is very much like the one that Laura used when Ma went and slapped that old bear. Let me put my book down for a minute and I'll show you the inside of it. It has a little doorway, and I'm going to take my little fake candle out. There's my little fake candle, and inside I have a little pink candle to show there's a place for the candle, and they would light it, and then they would secure it closed on the side. There's a little opening. This doesn't quite want to fit over the little hole in the handle, but that should secure, and if I had time I would do that, but there you go, and they would carry it by. Remember we said that the word of God is a lamp unto our path and a light unto our path, and a lamp unto our feet, or a lamp unto our path and a light unto our feet. Well, this is like a lantern, that lamp that they might have talked about too, more so in the colonial days and the time when Laura was around. Anyway, that's one thing I wanted to show you since we can't be together, which I miss being with you and teaching you in person. Let me get my story going because we're about to read the last chapter of Little House in the Big Woods, and it is called the Deer in the Wood. And here we go. It's chapter 13, the very last chapter of our book, and I hope you've enjoyed this story. It's a wonderful book of real history written by a real little girl, 5 years old, kindergarten age too. The grass was dry and withered, and the cows must be taken out of the woods and kept in the barn to be fed. All the bright colored leaves began to became dull brown when the cold rains of fall began. There was no more playing under the trees, but Pa was in the house when it rained, and he began to play the fiddle after supper. Then the rain stopped and the weather grew colder. In the early mornings, everything sparkled with frost. And here's a picture of a deer walking through a meadow, I suppose, or a little clearing in the woods. The days were growing short. That just means the sun's going down sooner. And a little fire burned all day on the cook stove to keep the house warm, or in the cook stove. Winter was not far away. The attic and the cellar were full of good things once more, and Laura and Mary had started to make patchwork quilts. Everything was beginning to be snug and cozy again. One night, when he came in from doing the chores, Pa said that after supper he would go to his deer lick and watch for a deer. There had been no fresh meat in the little house since spring, but now the fawns were grown up and Pa would go hunting again. Pa had made a deer lick in an open place in the woods, with trees nearby it in which he could sit to watch it. A deer lick was a place where the deer would come to get salt, and where I grew up in Pennsylvania, people would put a deer lick out and try to get the deer for the meat that they would give them in the fall. And where I grew up in the mountains, the first day of hunting season, all the boys and the dads got the day off, and I said, why don't we girls get that day off? But it was a different time then. So anyway, the deer lick supposedly attracts the deer to come to that place where you're hunting. When they found the salty place in the ground, they came there to lick it, and that was called a deer lick. Pa had made one by sprinkling salt over the ground. After supper, Pa took his gun and went into the woods, and Laura and Mary went to sleep without any stories or music. As soon as they woke up in the morning, they ran to their window, but there was no deer hanging in the trees. Pa had never gone out to get deer and come home without one. Laura and Mary did not know what to think. All day, Pa was busy banking the little house in the barn with dead leaves and straw held down by stones to keep out the cold. The weather grew colder all day, and there's Pa putting the stones up against where he put leaves, and that was to insulate the house. You have insulation in the walls of your house, but back then they had to do clever things like this to keep any kind of cold away from where they lived. And in Wisconsin, it was very cold in the winter time. Um, the weather grew colder all day, and that night there was once more a fire on the hearth, and the windows were shut tight and chinked for the winter. Remember what we called chink? That's where you put things in the empty spaces. It could be clay, it could be, sometimes people would use scraps of fabric to chink the little cracks in their walls in a log cabin house. After supper, Pa took Laura on his knee while Mary sat close in her little chair, and Pa said, "Now I'll tell you why you had no fresh meat to eat today. When I went out to the deer lick, I climbed up in a big oak tree. I found a place on a branch where I was comfortable and could watch the deer lick. I was near enough to shoot any animal that came to it, and my gun was loaded and ready on my knee. There I sat and waited for the moon to rise and light the clearing. I was a little tired from chopping wood all day yesterday, and I must have fallen asleep, for I found myself opening my eyes. The big round moon was just rising, and I could see it between the bare branches of the trees low in the sky, and right against it I saw a deer standing. His head was up, and he was listening. His great branching horns stood out above his head. He was dark against the moon. It was a perfect shot, but he was so beautiful. He looked so strong and free and wild that I couldn't kill him. I sat there and looked at him until he bounded away into the dark woods. Then I remembered that Ma and my little girls were waiting for me to bring home some good fresh venison. I made up my mind that next time I would shoot. After a while, a big bear came lumbering out into the open. Oh, he was so fat from feasting on berries and roots and grubs all summer that he was nearly as large as two bears. His head swayed from side to side as he went on all fours across the clear space in the moonlight until he came to a rotten log. He smelled it and listened. Then he pawed it apart and sniffed among the broken pieces, eating up the fat white grubs. Then he stood up on his hind legs, perfectly still, looking all around him. He seemed to be suspicious that something was wrong. He was trying to see or smell what it was. He was a perfect mark to shoot at, but I was so much interested in watching him, and the woods were so peaceful in the moonlight that I forgot all about my gun. I didn't even think of shooting him until he was waddling away into the woods. And here's a picture of, I'll show you this one. Here's a picture of Pa looking from the tree down at the deer. And that's how he did it without them smelling him or knowing he was there. I suppose you could still do that if you were a hunter. This will never do, I thought. I'll never get any meat this way. I settled myself into the tree and waited again. This time I was determined to shoot the next game I saw. The moon had risen and the higher, and the moonlight was bright in the little open place. All around it, the shadows were dark among the trees. After a long while, a doe and her yearling came stepping daintily out of the shadows. They were not afraid at all. They walked over to the place where I'd sprinkled the salt, and they both licked up a little of it. Then they raised their heads and looked at each other. The fawn stopped, stepped over, and stood beside the doe. They stood there together, looking at the woods in the moonlight. Their large eyes were shining and soft. I just sat there looking at them until they walked away among the shadows. Then I climbed down from the tree and came home. Laura whispered in his ear, I'm glad you didn't shoot them. Mary said, we can eat bread and butter. Pa lifted Mary up out of her chair and hugged them both together. You are my good girls, he said, and now it's bedtime. Run along while I get my fiddle. When Laura and Mary had said their prayers and were tucked snugly under the trundle bed's covers, Pa was sitting in the firelight with the fiddle. Ma had blown out the lamp because she did not need its light. On the other side of the hearth, she was swaying gently in her rocking chair, and her knitting needles flashed in and out above the socks she was knitting. The long winter evenings of firelight and music had come again. Pa's fiddle waited while Pa was singing, Oh, Susanna, don't you cry for me. I'm gone to California, the gold dust for to see. Oh, my goodness. When Pa began to play again, the song came out about old Grimes, but he did not sing the words. Excuse me. Excuse me. He did not sing the words that he had sung when Ma was making cheese. These words were different. Pa's strong, sweet voice was softly singing, Should old acquaintance be forgot and never brought to mind, should old acquaintance be forgot, and the days of auld lang syne, and the days of auld lang syne, my friend, and the days of auld lang syne, should auld acquaintance be forgot, and the days of auld lang syne. When the fiddle had stopped singing, Laura called out softly, What are the days of auld lang syne, Pa? They are the days of a long time ago, Laura. Pa said, Go to sleep now. But Laura lay awake a little while, listening to Pa's fiddle softly playing, and so the lonely sound of the wind in the big woods, and to the lonely sound of the wind in the big woods, she looked at Pa sitting on the bench by the hearth, the firelight gleaming on his brown hair and beard and glistening on the honey-brown fiddle. She looked at Ma, gently rocking and knitting. She thought to herself, this is now. She was glad that the cozy house and Pa and Ma and the firelight and the music were now. They could not be forgotten, she thought, because now is now. It can never be a long time ago. And I think that's why she wrote the book. And that is the end of our whole chapter book, 13 chapters long. You've listened well, boys and girls. It's been a fascinating journey. You do still have lap books to finish, and I've sent those extra pieces home. Fine, maybe lay them out there. I have a few more to give you when we all get back to school that you can take home and glue on. It's the different nuts and about Charlie, the little naughty boy. I didn't get to grab those in time. I did not have time to keep looking and looking for the things that I really thought you would need. So we'll just send those home when we all get back to school. I hope you've enjoyed this book. It's a great bit of American history, and Laura has about 6 or 7 more chapter books. I'll read one last of the little books that go with this, and then I'll read to you about Laura's husband when he was a little boy, and she named his books Farmer Boy. So I hope you've enjoyed, and I'll see you on the next one. Bye, boys and girls.